Welcome to yet another episode of the NewSpace India podcast. During 1934 and 1944 in Calcutta, Stephen Smith worked alone and unsupported on developing rocket transport. In 1935, he was the first to demonstrate the successful transport by rocket of livestock, food, and medicine. My guest today is Kirby Singh, whose book charts the story of Stephen Smith, described by a contemporary as the greatest one-man campaign for rocketry. He dedicated his life alone in northern India to develop a new revolutionary means of transport using only rocket power. The development of rockets in India is commonly understood to have ended with Tipu Sultan in 1799 and started again in 1963 when what is now called the Indian Space Research Organization. However, in the intervening period, rockets were built and championed by one man, working alone in Calcutta. On 14th February 1891, Stephen H. Smith, the only son of a tea plantation manager, was born in Strawberry Hill, region of Shillong. Between 1934 and 1944, he conducted over 200 rocket experiments to demonstrate the utility of rocket as a means of transport. Stephen Smith worked alone and unsupported in India. Today his work is found in the official NASA publications, the Journal of British Interplanetary Society, and the National Air and Space Museum. Kirby's book charts his struggles as well as his contacts with people like the King of Sikkim, with King George V, with a Member of Parliament in London, and a 25-year-long correspondence with a Swiss philatelist, reveals in his own words his struggle to attain recognition and support for his work. He also had a reluctant attempt to work with the military authorities in India during the World War II to gain support to his work. Post the Indian independence, he tried to contact the Governor of Bengal and the Prime Minister, then Nehru. However, with the many challenges of independent India, he failed to get any response from any of them. Kirby, the author of this book, is based in the UK. In 2017, he published a book, The Indian Space Program, which is one of the very detailed accounts of the Indian space capabilities and achievements that stands today. Kirby, welcome to the NewSpace India podcast yet again. I'm very glad to have you as a guest to talk about your new book, India's Forgotten Rocket Pioneer, Stephen Smith, From Pigeon Mail to Rocket Mail.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So I just finished reading the copy of your book, a couple of days ago, and the book is very fresh in my mind. And it's a fascinating book, and thank you very much for researching on this topic because this is something that I think hardly anybody knows, that India had somebody experimenting on rockets in the 1930s. And so I just wanted to begin the podcast by asking you, what is the new information that your book provides in the story of Stephen Smith?
Well, I came across the work of Stephen Smith whilst researching my earlier book, The Indian Space Program, and I noticed this huge gap in the story of rockets in India between the end of what Tipu Sultan did in 1799 and the launch of the Nike Apache rocket by India in Kospa, or ISRO as it later came to know, in Thumba in 1963. Nobody was doing work with rockets, as far as I could tell. But then, during that research for the Indian Space Program, I came across Stephen Smith, who was conducting fairly simple rocket experiments in India, in and around Calcutta. Between 1934 and 1944, he conducted over 200 rocket mail experiments. And it wasn't just rocket mail. He used rockets to transport medicines and even living creatures. He was doing something that many other countries were doing, but he did it for the longest period, for about 10 years, whilst similar experimenters in Europe and America did it for a much shorter period. And his first rocket was launched in 1934. And that's the time when a lot of rocketry societies were forming around Europe and the US, Belgium, Netherlands, and Britain, and of course Germany. So Smith was a contemporary of Werner von Braun, Hermann Oberth, Robert Goddard. Now, Smith's contribution in rocketry was nowhere comparable with theirs, but I discovered a letter in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., where Phil Cleater, who was the founder of the British Interplanetary Society in 1933 here in Liverpool, exchanging letters with Edward Pendray, who was the founder of the American Interplanetary Society. The letters from 1936, where they're both exchanging details. Cleater is talking about Smith's work, and Pendray is talking about Robert Goddard's work. So Smith's work is right up there, taking place amidst the time when rockets were first being experimented with. Also, in 1934, late 1934, just after Smith conducted his very first rocket mail experiment, he joined the British Interplanetary Society and sent reports of his rocket mail experiments to the BIS. They were published in the Bulletin of the BIS in 1935. And the editor of the BIS Bulletin at the time was a teenager, Arthur C. Clarke. So what I discovered that he, through the letters and papers, that he actually did have a presence at a time when a lot of the pioneering work was being done in India. And of course, in the period he was doing, there was World War II, Indian independence, huge upheaval at that time. And the coincidence of timing meant that a lot of the work he did really fell in the shadows of other much greater world events, and even in his letters. Stephen Smith wrote to many people, including Prime Minister Nehru, but he didn't get the recognition. So I wanted, through this book, to bring him and his work out of the shadow, and I considered that Israel is a place where his work should be recognized. And I was so delighted that the former Israel chairman, Kiran Kumar, agreed to write a foreword for this book.
Excellent. And you mentioned that this was a link that you established, from the days of your research of your first book, which is the Indian Space Program. How did you come across Stephen Smith during this research? Was it somebody who was passing who mentioned it to you, or what was the link, in the research?
I wish I could remember precisely how that happened, but I wanted to doing some research online, and it was the philatelic community, stamp collectors, who have written and documented a lot of the work that Stephen Smith did. And Stephen Smith wasn't alone. There were many other people like Germany's Gerhard Zucker and Karel Roberti in the Netherlands and Friedrich Schmiedel in Austria. So a lot of that work was documented online, and it's in connection with those works that I saw Stephen Smith. And although Stephen Smith doesn't sound Indian, but he was Indian. He was born in Assam, but his father was from England. He was a Christian. He was brown-skinned like me, but I'm sure he spoke Hindi really well, but his English was really excellent. So it was through this philatelic community, the writings and the catalogues that record a lot of the work that Stephen Smith did. And there are organizations. I'm really surprised and impressed with how rich the activities of the philatelic community in India is right now. And also outside India, there's the Philatelic Society, as well as the Philatelic Society of India inside India. There are many organizations outside India, like the India Study Circle, and there's an equivalent one in Germany, the ISE in Britain, and the similar organizations in Germany, which specialize in male history of India. And it's in their writings that I found a lot of the documented evidence of the work that he did. And even today, if you can find some rare covers that were flown by Stephen Smith, they can cost up to $20,000. And many of the individuals since then I've contacted in India. I'll just mention a couple of names, if I may. There's Parish Kaitan and Mark and Dave, Ramu Srinivasa, and also Pradeep Jain. Most of these names have no connection with the space world, but only in the philatelic world. But they recorded in their working in books that the work that Stephen Smith did in rocketry. And since then, I also found work in NASA documents that mentioned his work. Museums like the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., the Postal Museum in London, and many private collections in Liverpool and Bern in Switzerland have records not only of his work, but letters that he wrote. One individual that he established a very long relationship with was a Dr. Robert Paganini. And it's really the records that Robert Paganini, kept for 25-year-long correspondence with Smith. Although they never met, Paganini was in Switzerland and Smith was mostly in Calcutta in India. They communicated for 25 years, and those letters directly from Smith, which I saw in the Communication Museum in Bern, were really the foundations for this book. Paganini died in December 1950, and one of the items I found in that archive was a will. And in that will, Paganini left Smith a quarter of everything he had. And this was somebody he'd never spoken to or met, and they were thousands of miles away. But sadly, Smith himself died just 2 months later. So he himself did not benefit, but it just goes to show the deep and sincere relationship these two men had over that very long period.
Yeah, that's really a fascinating introduction. So, just to get down to the process itself, I would love to know, what was the process of your research in coming up with the book itself?
I'd done a little bit of research whilst writing for the Indian space program, and one of the only time that Smith ever went out of India was to Sikkim. Now, at that time, Sikkim was a separate entity. It is in 1935. Today it's part of India, or became part of India in 1975. I'd seen all these items online and books and papers, but I really didn't have any tangible evidence that Smith ever existed. I'd never been able to speak or communicate with anyone who'd met him. So in one of my research trips to India for the Indian space program, I went to Calcutta and I went to Elliott Road, where Smith had lived. I visited his house, but of course it had been handed over but many times since then. But I did meet Melvin Brown, who was a writer on Anglo-Indian subjects, and he told me that he had met Smith's son Hector, and that was my first connection. And the other connection was I went to the cemetery in Circular Road Cemetery in Calcutta, and although I didn't see his gravestones, I saw his grave, but it was the entry in the records of the cemetery where I saw his full name, the year of his birth and the year he died, that I actually had for the very first time tangible evidence that he existed. So I actually ended up going to a gravestone to ensure that my ghosts were realised, rather than looking for ghosts in a graveyard. But the other trip I made at that time was a trip to Sikkim. I went to the archives in Gangtok, where they had a file still recording from most of the correspondence from Smith with the King of Sikkim at the time. And Smith made 2 visits to Sikkim, where he wanted to show that his rockets in particular areas of the undulating hilly landscape of Sikkim, which is in the foothills of the Himalayas, would be particularly useful where traditionally roads are very difficult. So he demonstrated that he could send mail from one part of Gangtok to another very quickly, and this is particularly useful at times of emergency like earthquakes or floods. And that, along with other evidence from people that I've since met, particularly the Paganini archive, served as the foundation for the material I used in the book.
One of the links that I thought here that we could discuss about is everybody or most people who I know in the space community know a little bit about Tipu Sultan and the bamboo rockets that Tipu Sultan's regime had. And then the Congreve confiscating a lot of them and taking it back to England. And that's a very well known or relatively well known part of history than Smith. So what led to Smith's story being almost forgotten in the context of Indian history in that sense, because as you said, Smith is a part of the philatelic community, and his story was captured by them. But I think the whole rocketry part of it is completely ignored by any of the historians, I would say, to a large extent, capturing Indian history. I mean, do you think there was a generational gap, and also because Tipu Sultan was a king, and then a kingdom attached to it, so maybe that was very well recorded by historians rather than Smith, who was just a normal person?
Well, I think the main reason why there isn't a great deal of record of Smith's work in India is because he was not. There's two parts to that answer, really. One was that at the time that Smith was doing this, he was surrounded by really quite dramatic world events. We had the independence movement in India, then World War II, there was a famine in Calcutta, there was the independence itself and post-independence riots. And in Calcutta, there's a lot of rioting and fighting and a lot of shortage of basic materials. So Smith, surprisingly, when you look at him with that background, it's amazing that he was able to do this kind of work under those circumstances. And the other reason is that a lot of the contacts that he had were international. And I think this is the other thing that I discovered through my research, that for the first time I realized that most of his work was published outside India and valued outside India. And mainly this was because of Smith's doing. He was a member of the British Interplanetary Society. He had a very strong connection with Robert Paganini. And so a lot of the work and recognition he was getting was taking place outside India. Exactly why Smith, didn't get a larger support from within India it's a bit of a mystery. I don't know. I can't see why, with such a huge population, he wasn't able to partner up with other people, like-minded people in India. But in a way, Smith did benefit from the work that was done in developing the Congreve rockets. So the Congreve rockets were the rockets that were developed using Tipu's rockets from 1799 onwards, but they were brought over to London and developed by William Congreve. And a lot of the enhancements he made, a lot of them were in the development of the fuel, the black powder. And Smith used, I'm saying indirectly, those enhanced products because the rocket fuel that Smith used in his rockets came from commercial manufacturers. There were two companies, British but based in Calcutta, the Orient Fireworks Company and James Paine and Sons. They produced what in modern rocketry we call grains, but in Smith's time he called cartridges, and they were the basis of his propulsion, and he'd buy these pretty much ready-made, and these fuels were the products of the enhancements that Congreve had introduced. But later, although he doesn't share a great deal of information on this is about 1944, Smith says that he's using compressed air and gas as propellants in multi-stage rockets. He talks about it very briefly in one or two letters, and he keeps records of the flights, but in terms of the technical details of how he was getting the compressed air, what kind of gas he was using, there's no detail. But there is a direct link, even though Smith might not have known, but he did benefit from the work that Congreve did in developing propellants.
Yeah, the interesting question there is, did Smith ever read about Tipu Sultan's work, or later Congreve's work, and or was it just coincidence that some of their works or some of their background benefited him?
I don't know. There's no evidence in what I've seen that he refers to reading about either Tipu's work or Congreve's work. But I do know that he wrote several books. He wrote about 5 books and produced about another 7 or 8 that he never published. And one of them was about balloons, early days of balloons. And because he was doing this research, and he complains how expensive it was, how difficult it was, and again, doing it alone and unfunded, I'm pretty sure that he would have come across both the work of Tipu Sultan and Congreve, but in the documents and letters that I've seen, there's no reference to Tipu Sultan or any of the other work specifically. He just talks about the work on balloons that he's doing. He wrote books about birds, aerophilatelic birds, birds in the aerophilatelic community. But a lot of the work he did a lot of research. He talks about having completed books, but he never published them. So I know, because he was a researcher, that he would have come across the work of Tipu Sultan and William Congreve, but he never writes about them and never mentions them. So I see no evidence of that.
Of course, Smith was inspired by the aerophilatelic community, as you mentioned in the book, and his primary connection, before rocket mail, it was about collecting, mail and stamps and mint and all of these things around the aerophilatelic community. So I was thinking, one of the questions that I had was that if somebody claimed that I flew this on an aircraft or an airmail, how would I believe that it is really flown if I would have to buy it? So because it's anybody could claim that a particular stamp was flown from X place to X on an aircraft and it's of value, but how would somebody authenticate it?
That's a real issue, and the problem is still around today. You can go out and buy an autographed photograph of, say, Buzz Aldrin today, and it's quite expensive on eBay, and they have a similar issue. So they're very frequently accompanied by a signed and dated certification or certificate of authentication. Now, you could say that they could perhaps, forge that too, but yeah. There's one incident, actually, in a letter that Smith wrote to Leslie Johnson, who was the vice president of the BIS. And in addition to letters, Smith would fly other things like medicines and foods, as well as living creatures. And one of the things he flew in one of his rockets was a miniature bottle of Long John whiskey. And in his letter in 1937 to Leslie Johnson, he says, look, if you could put me in touch with the company, Long John Whiskey Company, then I can sell them this miniature bottle with a letter to authenticate that it has been flown on a rocket. So this concept of certification of authentication was around then, and is still around today. And ultimately, you have to do some due diligence, especially when the prices of what you buying is quite expensive, and be satisfied that what you are buying is real and has the kind of providence to show that it's the case. Because as I was saying earlier, some of these phone items can be thousands of dollars, and since then there's been much more, many more space flown items, which is a vibrant market these days. I was really one of the things I realized. But yes, the answer is, as far as it goes, is a certificate of authentication that's supplied by the seller.
You mentioned that Stephen Smith starts experimenting with rockets, and I've done some experiments by myself on not rockets but using high altitude stratospheric balloons for quite some time. And one of the challenges that you see with such objects is that it's very hard to predict where they go, and because they hardly have any systems where you can very accurately fire them. And so one of the things that came up in my mind while reading was how accurate were these rockets. And the other question here is, it's very difficult to retrieve anything that is flown, especially if it's traveling quite some distance, because with our balloon experiments, for example, it used to fly 10, 15, 20 kilometers away, and if you didn't have very good GPSs on them, it would be very difficult to retrieve them. And during Smith's time, of course, there was no GPS to retrieve to know where exactly it fell. So even in our case, right, where we had some of these balloons, actually the payloads being taken away by villagers who found them just before we even arrived at the scene, and they would take them and then keep them at their houses, or we would go and hunt them down. So I was thinking, how come that some of this stuff didn't happen during Stephen Smith's time, or did it happen? This was an interesting thought that came up in my mind.
And a very valid one. There's two aspects to this. One is that I saw an announcement recently, just a few days ago, that SpaceX stopped sharing details of their manifest of their launches, whereas in the past they always put stuff on their websites. So there's this idea that people who are at the forefront of this technology want to keep it private. There's that aspect to it. So there's a letter that I saw in the National Air and Space Museum from Friedrich Schmiedel to a guy called Francis in the UK. And in that letter, Schmiedel complains that people are claiming very long distances their rockets cover, and particularly he singles out Gerhard Zucker, who claiming that his rockets were reaching a distance of between 4 and 9 kilometers. And Schmiedel's, the longest distance he claimed was about 2,400 meters, about 2.5 kilometers. So Schmiedel was concerned that a lot of people were just making this up. And I think that's pretty accurate. Of all the people around, Schmiedel, who was technically the most competent of the rocket mill experimenters, who'd been was very technical. He's an engineer. He'd been taught by 2 Nobel laureates in the Vienna Technical Hochschule. He had a lot of the skills, but certainly Smith and Gerhard Zucker didn't. So they were just estimating. They just looked and figured out how far their rockets were taking, what kind of range they had, and the altitudes they were reaching. They didn't have the instruments to measure precisely how high these or how far they traveled, and they probably didn't have the technical capability to use the engineering instruments that would have allowed them to get some precise measurements. So I think, so as a result of that, Schmiedel says, I'm not going to share any more of my details. And in fact, in that letter, he also talks about writing to Smith, asking him how far his rockets are going, but Schmiedel complains that he didn't get a response. So there's a lot of information that people feel they want to keep secret, there's a lot of exaggeration, a bit like we have in modern times. Some companies in startups can exaggerate their worth or their claims of what they've achieved, and it was like that in those days. Schmiedel's, he also experimented with stratospheric rockets. He launched rockets from balloons. So he was quite high up in the in the Austrian Alps, and he would launch a balloon, which, when it reached a particular altitude, would launch a rocket. And he achieved some incredibly high altitudes. But one of his rockets landed in Hungary, and this is the other technique that they used to make sure that they got their rockets back, and they knew exactly where they'd got, by putting in a little message in the rocket when it landed that whoever found it should return it to this location, to this address, and they would get a reward for it. And it's that payback that made a lot of the people return items that they were found. But it was very competitive in those days, as it is these days.
That's pretty damn interesting to know the mechanics of all of it, and how history kind of repeats despite technology changes all the time. So one of the interesting happenings with Smith is that Smith is based in Calcutta, which was the capital of then British India, and to a certain extent maybe benefited because Calcutta is also the port where a lot of activity happens, and also was the political capital. But I think during the 1930s is when Delhi took off, and Stephen Smith was just beginning to experiment with his rockets then. So do you think that because Calcutta was not the political center anymore, the access that Smith would have gotten reduced quite a lot, and if Calcutta remained the political capital and a lot of the political access of people were available to Smith, then he would have benefited a lot more?
This is interesting. Yes, it was in 1931 that New Delhi became the official capital, but because Calcutta had this very rich history, where all the initial where the big players were, where this is sort of centre of British trade, and many of the other Western powers were based. It was a very cosmopolitan city. And so Smith continued to benefit from those connections, but also because, despite his efforts, Smith really wasn't able to make any high-level political contacts. So the fact that the political centre moved to Delhi didn't really affect him very much. But he still continued to make use of the powerful and rich and well-connected elite in Calcutta. He, in fact, made contact with one Jewish family, David Ezra, and his wife Rachel Sassoon. Both were very influential in Calcutta society, and they made their home available to Smith for his Indian Airmail Society meetings and get-togethers. And also through them, he was able to communicate his work and get a larger India-wide but also international visibility that his work would not otherwise have gained. He also benefited from Rachel Sassoon. She became much more involved in the philatelic activities that Smith was involved in. But specifically, Rachel Sassoon had a cousin, Philip Sassoon, who was an MP in London. And I'm sure through that connection, Smith wrote a letter in 1936 seeking support for his work with rockets. But by 1936, so this was a year after Gerhard Zucker had been testing rockets in England and Scotland, and largely they had gone spectacularly unsuccessful. And the reports in newspapers in England were showing that really he was very much a showman, but he was very unsuccessful in his rockets. So the request that Sir Philip Sassoon got from Smith was turned down for support, mainly on the back of the failures of Gerhard Zucker. And they concluded that the rockets were going everywhere except where they were intended to go, because there was just no ability to control them. And that was sad, because it was Zucker's work in 1934 that initially got Smith to get going with his rocket mills in India. And it's because of Zucker and the largely international coverage of his failures that brought the whole of the rocket mill into a bit of disrepute. And certainly as far as the British government was concerned, it was a non-starter. Smith didn't get any support for his work, and a lot of the people in the philatelic community were disheartened because of the reputation loss that Zucker brought to the whole of the philatelic and rocket mill community itself. So sad, but being in Calcutta was no major difficulty for Smith at the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting that Stephen Smith thought about rocketry as very civilian approaches to use of rocketry, because he thinks about rocketry in terms of mail initially, and then he thinks about rocketry as a part of transporting items of use in disasters, or transporting items more quickly from either from ship to shore or in challenging geographies. But only during the war does he think about rocketry in terms of military means, or more focused in terms of military efforts. But I always wonder, in Smith's story, is there any time that he thought, uh, the Indian right wing movement for independence would have been an avenue for him to get more support in terms of monetary means? Because of course there was a lot of like peaceful protest against British occupation in India, and the Gandhian way of doing things, but also I mean, I imagine there was, of course, a very also a right wing approach to maybe taking up arms against British in India, to kick them out of India for Indian independence. So, do you think because Stephen Smith was a Christian and then had Christian values, it kept him, not to connect with this kind of community, or was it something else?
It's a really interesting perspective. Now, I've not seen anything documented, so this is just my take on this issue. But if you look at what how others fared, Sergei Korolev was imprisoned by the Soviet authorities in Russia, and later he worked for the state. And likewise, Werner von Braun, he worked under very difficult circumstances in the Nazi Party under Hitler, but he, like Korolev, was working on what he loved doing. So he put up with a great deal of the environment that he perhaps otherwise would not have. So as far as Smith is concerned, I think he also challenged his own views and decided that he wanted to continue with his rocket testing. So he supported, if you like, the approach of the then British Indian government. And also remember, his father was British. He came from eastern England, from a town called Brigg, about 100 kilometers from where I am right now. And he was very much a British citizen. He saw himself as a British citizen, and he had all the contacts with the mostly Western communities in Calcutta. He was member of he considered himself, although he doesn't say this, as an Anglo-Indian by virtue of his father, certainly. But also, I think he, if you look at his writing, he writes really good English. He asserted his Indianness, but in the early days he knew that he was going to get the most support from the British government, and therefore it was in his interest, I think, and I'm speculating, that he should be on the side of the British, so to speak, and that's why he wrote to the British MP seeking support. Later, after independence, or certainly after the war, when it was pretty obvious that the British were going to leave, he then asserted his Indianness. He says in a letter that he is an Indian, and he wrote to the governor of West Bengal seeking support and in recognition of his work. He even wrote to Prime Minister Nehru. But, these were challenging times, and there's no record of him ever getting an answer from Nehru or any of the others. But no, he always remained apolitical, but he did turn to the military, the British authorities who were running India, and then the independent Indian Prime Minister to seek support. And he was doing what Korolev and von Braun were doing. He just wanted to ensure that he could develop his rockets, and he would take the support from wherever it came.
Yes, you did mention that his father was British. So I was wondering, why did he not try, like immigrating back to England where he could have carried on doing his work, maybe with much more better access and funding?
So in the days of British India, he was trying to secure funds from the British government, and after independence, he tried likewise with the Nehru government. But why he didn't go himself to Britain, I don't know. So I know that from about 1944 onwards, he had several spells when he was severely ill, and I'm sure that had an impact on his decision. Some of the letters that I found in the Communication Museum in Bern, he writes poignantly about the profound shifts in population. This is the end of the Second World War, towards independence and everything that's happening there. And in March 1944, he writes to Robert Paganini saying, "I should have died by the 13th of March. I was very bad. Nobody expected me to live." So he was probably too ill to travel, and the tumultuous events taking around him meant that he himself could not practically travel. And by the time things did settle down in the early 1950s, Paganini had died in December 1950, and Smith himself died in February 1951. I think if he'd lived a little longer, he perhaps would have travelled to England. Indeed, his son Hector and his wife did go to England, and they are settled. They were settled here. Hector died early on, soon after he arrived, but his wife, up until about 3 years ago, I know, was still alive and living in London. So this was Stephen Smith's daughter-in-law, and his granddaughter and great-granddaughter are still around in London today.
One of the great insights that you put out in the book is the friendship between Stephen Smith and Robert Paganini, two people who never met but had a letter based relationship for 25 years, and at the end of which Paganini writes one-fourth of his estate in the name of Stephen Smith, which is fascinating that two people separated by a continent who never met can develop such deep friendships just by mails between each other during the time. So I was, wondering how did Stephen Smith connect with Paganini in the first instance? Because I know that both of them are a part of the philatelic community. Was there yellow pages for the philatelic community that was passing around where people could then, get in touch with each other, or how did it work?
Yeah, you're right. There's no yellow pages, and of course, there's no internet. In 1924, Smith decided he'd been interested in collecting stamps and being a philatelist, but in 1924 he set up what later came to be known as the Indian Airmail Society. And by that time, Robert Paganini had set up his similar society in Switzerland for about a dozen years. Robert Paganini in Switzerland was one of the first to produce a catalogue of airmails, because the very first airmail in Switzerland took place in about 1912. And Paganini, recognized the importance and decided to document and record that. He was the founder of philately in Switzerland. So by the time it was 1924 and Smith was trying to set up a similar organization in India, he communicated with Paganini. He must have known about this because he would have read similar books and journals. And he invited Paganini to be an honorary member of the Indian Airmail Society. And in 1925, Paganini accepts, and he writes to him, says, "I'm very honoured." And that's the start of that 25-year-long correspondence relationship. And in those days, the way to communicate with the outside world was through written journals or bulletins or reports or books and catalogues. They, especially in very largely continental divided people, they never really met. Phone calls were even more rarer. So journals from these societies and newspaper articles and letters were the means of communication. But the first contact was between when Smith wrote to Paganini inviting him to join as an honorary member of his Indian Airmail Society that he'd just founded.
Your book is having a lot of characters, and the way you talk about them is very interesting because there's Gerhard Zucker, there is Friedrich Schmiedel, there is Ley, there is Stephen Smith, of course, and all these characters who have a touch between philatelic societies and rocketry. And two of them I find very interesting are both, as you said, Gerhard Zucker, who was a German who was experimenting on rockets and mostly, doing theatrics rather than more rocketry in England. And Friedrich Schmiedel, of course, an Austrian who's had this engineering background and had the rigor to do research. But Stephen Smith interestingly chooses Gerhard Zucker's theatrics as an inspiration rather than the rigor of Friedrich Schmiedel. Was this because Zucker was more popular in England and his theatrics were more popular in England?
I'm guessing, I'm speculating that, and Smith does say very clearly that it was the work of Zucker that motivated him in his rocket mails. I think it was because it happened in England. Smith's looking at Schmiedel's work in Austria, and which is far superior in terms of the engineering quality of the work that Schmiedel is doing in Austria. But Zucker does it in England, and I think Smith sees himself as a British subject, and he recognizes the king as a loyal subject, and he takes his lead because this is happening in England. That was the motivation, I think, for Smith to choose Zucker's work as a trigger. But just a word about why this concept of rocket mail came into being. So in the early days, remember all these societies and organizations, and in Smith's case, he's just a lone individual in India, they have to fund themselves. And one of the ways they can fund themselves is by making use of these rockets and getting some sort of return. And there were three key ways. One of them was, this is very unusual, and it was tried in Germany. You might recall the Fritz Lang film from 1929, Frau im Mond, The Woman in the Moon. And this film was a sci-fi film, and it needed a scene of a rocket launch. And Hermann Oberth was played a part in developing a rocket that would launch, and that launch sequence would form part of the film. So you could get income by involving yourself with the film industry, or as in Schmiedel's case, he was interested in using rockets to do research. And Willy Ley, also a German, but later went to America, considered that scientific research for these rockets is where the benefits lay. And the third option was using rockets to transport something from one place to another. Initially, as souvenirs, these items could be sold. So just about every rocket that Smith launched carried some form of commemorative covers, they would be called. They were like pretty much postcards with various stamps on them and cachets indicating what event that was being commemorated. So this was a way for grassroots organizations which had little or no income to generate income for them, to allow them to continue. And Willy Ley, for example, he was part of the Verein für Raumschifffahrt, the VFR, the German society, which was the earliest one that's founded in Berlin in 1926 or thereabouts. But as Hitler came to power, Willy Ley left and went to America. But he did come to the UK first. He was invited by Phil Cleater, the founder of the British Interplanetary Society, and he gave a few presentations in Liverpool. And later, all of these people were members of each other's organizations. So Willy Ley and later von Braun were honorary members of the British Interplanetary Society. And indeed, in 1961, von Braun was given a gold medal by the British Interplanetary Society. And remember, he was a German who bombed, or whose bombs caused some damage in London. And there was a lot of disagreement within the society in Britain on the sense of him getting this award from British organisation. But a lot of these individuals were members of each other's organisations, and they needed support. And the best way for Smith, of all the three options, was to go with the rocket mail option. And that's how he funded himself for most of the time he was testing rockets.
Smith, of course, has a very interesting background in terms of his knowledge and his career. You mentioned in your book that Smith started off as a police officer and then became a customs agent, and then eventually was a dentist. And then, of course, he had an interest in neurophilately and then got into rockets and rocket development. That's really very different jobs from one to the other. So I would imagine that Smith had very little knowledge on designing rockets themselves, and technical expertise of going into what goes into rocket development might not have been with Smith because his lack of knowledge in any kind of engineering. So with that taken into account, he is working with local vendors to get gunpowder or whatever the powder to fuel his rockets, and he's trying to build these rockets. So and of course, he's also trying to experiment in new ideas, like trying to get mail from ship into shore, and trying to save time by ships not docking into the shore, but essentially trying to save some hours of getting the mail from the ship flown on a rocket. So I had two questions there. One is, what was his link to designing these kinds of rockets, and did he pick up any technical expertise on the way? And the other is, how safe are these rockets if somebody had to fly them from a ship to the shore, and how accurate were they?
Well, you're quite right. Smith had no technical or engineering skills. I'm sure over time he did develop some gradually, but he did have some artistic skills in addition to designing many stamps, and indeed he designed the very first airmail stamp for India. He did, if you look at some of the rockets, and I've got some pictures in the book, he's got very aerodynamic and symmetric drawings of the aerofoils on some of his rockets. He used fins and vanes and rudders to make sure, or he thought he would like to control where the rockets landed when they were returning to Earth. Although he tried parachutes, he recognized that parachutes were at the mercy of the atmosphere, and he could not control where they landed. So if you look at some of the models of the rockets that he drew, I think he had some practical skills in terms of drawing and making. He physically made all his rockets, but in terms of engineering skills, he had none. In fact, he contacted a guy called Victor Pont in the early 30s. And Victor Pont had been was a British railway engineer. He'd been based in Calcutta in the late 1920s when he was a member of the Indian Airmail Society, so he knew him personally. But he tried to invite him to work together. He said that he would love to have an engineer that he could work with. I'm just puzzled as to why nobody else approached Smith and offered their skills, because that's one thing that he lacked. Smith lacked, he did pretty much everything himself because he had no one else to work with. Why that was the case, given that he was in such a place like Calcutta, I'm sure there were people with appropriate skills who could help him, but he never hooked up with anybody who could do that for him. So he was just pretty much struggling all the way through. When it comes to ship-to-shore rockets, so one of in fact, the very first rocket that Smith launched in September 1934 was from a ship on the Hooghly River to an island, Soga Island, which was pretty much uninhabited, but it had a lighthouse. But he wanted to demonstrate that, particularly in bad weather, when ships can't go into harbour, or indeed if there are places in the world where there is no safe harbour, you can just, from a passing ship, just launch the mail from a ship to the shore. And, for his early attempts, he had a lot of failures, but in terms of accuracy, he didn't need a great deal. As long as people could see the ship, they could monitor the rocket launch and pick up the mail when it landed. It just solved a real world problem. So ship to shore and less successful shore to ship techniques were tried, although Smith himself didn't really continue to have a great deal of success in those areas, but the technology for that, or the technique, had been around for a long time, not just in India but elsewhere. So it was a way of showing that there was some value in rockets, but it was not particularly accurate, but didn't need to be that accurate, and that's why he used this pretty much uninhabited island as his first experiment.
Your book also taught me some very interesting facts, like the first airmail in the world, being carried in India. That was really interesting to read the history of airmail and how India is in the middle of it. But of course, one of the things that you mentioned in your book is how apathetic Smith's own family was, in his interest of airmail and rocket mail. And you talk about how difficult it was to get, for example, his family to comment or to participate in your research. Do you get a sense of why is that case? Was it because Smith's family had to live through the Bengal famine and the Indian independence struggle and the post-independence problems, and they just wanted to get over with all of it, and that's why they didn't want to have any of it?
I don't know. So I had hoped initially after the writing the Indian Space Program book that if I found his family, I would write about Smith. I did find his family, but they were not interested. And now, by the time his kids were grown up and old enough, they pretty much left India, started a new life in England, and a lot of the work that he'd done had been, they were very detached from it, physically as well as, I think, psychologically. But I didn't, they expressed, they were quite proud of the work. His granddaughter in an email said to me that had he been doing his work today, he would have far better recognition than he did get in his time. So they're quite proud of him. They recognise the work, but they just don't want to come forward and talk about it or be in the media in any sense. So I respected their decision. And if you look at the family tree that I've drawn about Smith's origins, I just use first names. I really don't have an answer, but it's a personal matter and it's their choice. And had I not found the huge collection of Smith's letters in the Museum for Communication in Bern that Robert Paganini had archived, I would not have access to Smith's own words, and this book would never have been written. But his family made a choice, and I respect that.
One of the interesting things that Smith does is writing these letters, and he's communicating to the Western audience, especially the British and American newspapers, about his experiments and the developments that he's been doing in India. So now there is, of course, in journalism, you have to authenticate your source and you have to clarify that something's really happened. But a lot of these newspapers are publishing Smith's claims. Was there a way of verifying his work that these newspapers did, or were they just writing it as articles that claim that has been taken by someone?
Well, one of the impressive things about Smith was that he was not quite in the way that Zucker was, but he really did have good connections with journalists. The Star of India was one of the newspapers that pretty much followed him everywhere. And indeed, in one instance, they requested a demonstration, which really didn't go very well. But at the request of newspapers, he did some launches. So just about every launch he did, he would try to get the newspaper journalists from the Star of India and others, if he could get them, to join him. So in India, the work was being published by journalists who were witnessing his experiments. And these reports were syndicated, as happens these days, in newspapers around the world. And it's surprising how much interest there was, because even following his first trip to Sikkim, some guy in New Jersey wanted to get some of the flown covers from his Sikkim trip, and all he'd seen was the newspaper report. So he wrote to the King of Sikkim, and then that letter was passed on to Smith. So he got a surprisingly global coverage at the time, but there's no specific international journalists from other countries in India who did that. It's just through normal syndication. But one of the things that Smith's letters reveal is that through his connection of global contacts, he would ask people like Leslie Johnson and Robert Paganini. He would send them reports of his experiments and say, "Oh, can you put these in your journals, in your newspapers?" And very often they did. And they did that. It's because of that Smith achieved this recognition outside India, which was very important to the work he was doing for his own success. Because in addition to getting the reports of his work out, it allowed him to sell his covers to international collectors. And when he was selling outside India, he could usually attract higher prices than he could inside India. So people like Johnson and Paganini were instrumental in many ways in helping to get his word out and also helping him generate income.
You describe, some of the very interesting experiments that Smith was doing, and in one instance, he's experimenting, trying to put live animals, and in one instance, he's put a snake inside a rocket and he's flown it, and I thought that was a very unusual, choice, because if it's some other livestock that people can use, it's interesting, but I don't know how people would use a snake if it came out of a rocket. But the other bit is, of course, he's claiming that these rockets are flown so to such a height, and I wonder if you had a sense as to why he made this unusual choice of a snake in some instances, and in others, how he would have measured the height of the rocket. Was it just by what he would imagine seeing them fly, or because I don't imagine any of these rockets having any kind of measurement instruments on them.
You're dead right. There's no altimeter built into them, certainly. The answer to the two-part question is both. I don't really know. So on the first part, how he measured them, I'm pretty sure that, like Zucker and others, it was more of a qualitative observation rather than a quantitative measurement. So he was just giving the best shot as he could in terms of range and altitude. As to why he put a snake in there, I have no idea, but it is peculiar. He did about 3 experiments which carried living creatures, and the first one carried 2 small chicks, and that he called Adam and Eve. And in the experiment that carried a snake, he also carried an apple. And I thought, I'm just speculating here, he was a Christian. Maybe there's some sort of a biblical connection between Adam and Eve and an apple and a snake. I don't really know. But one interesting thing that I did discover, I thought that when I embarked on this, that Stephen Smith was the first one to use rockets to demonstrate that living creatures could be transported using rocket power and rocket power alone. But this took place in 1935 for Smith, for the first one. But I discovered, I wrote to a contact, and she was in her 90s, and she sent me a letter that she'd received from Friedrich Schmiedel, who had conducted, I think so far, the very first experiment that transported living creatures using rocket power. He had demonstrated in Austria that he could transport butterflies and beetles. And it was just, so far as I can see, a one-off experiment. And in the letter she says that Schmiedel writes that the beetles after the flight scurried away and they were live and healthy, but he doesn't make any similar claims, or Schmiedel doesn't make any similar claims for the butterfly. So I'm wondering if the lack of 100% success of that flight meant that Schmiedel didn't pursue it any further, or indeed that he didn't think it was something he wanted to pursue. Schmiedel was also doing some really advanced work in terms of the whole idea of rockets and doing high altitude research. His tutors had done one of his Nobel Prize winning tutors had done some experiments in high altitude and cosmic rays, and he was trying to see if some seeds that had flown into high altitudes might be affected by the radiation, and exactly how far he got in that experiment, I'm not quite sure, but Schmiedel didn't publish that, or didn't make a big thing out of those experiments as others had done. but also by the late 1930s, as Hitler came into power and Austria was pretty much invaded, Schmiedel was very concerned that his work might be used for military means and destroyed most of it. So a lot of the work and the records he'd kept were destroyed at that time.
Of course, as we discussed, Stephen Smith's initial inspiration was airmail, and you do mention in your book that after a certain point of time, he almost entirely dependent on his earnings from rocket mail to have his life conducted. So given that airmail was maturing, given that he had also interest in airmail, I was thinking that that would have been also interesting for him to pursue and to keep up while he was going on with his rocket mail stuff. Was that the case where he was still experimenting or trading stuff with airmail and trying to use that also for the rocket mail activities?
He pretty much never came out of the experimental phase. He came around. He was started school in 1903 when the first aeroplanes were successfully tested in the US. And when he was leaving school was the time in 1911 when there was the very first airmail in India, in Allahabad, which is not very far from where he was in India, in Assam. So I think he was motivated, a bit like maybe you and I are, by whatever the leading technology is of today. And for us, it's space. I think if he had had the financial support, he perhaps would have liked to have learned to fly and indeed fly himself. But although he was privately educated. He wasn't particularly well off, but rocket mail was a compromise. So he wanted to stay in the leading edge of transport technology as he could have seen it at that time. So just practicing developing rocket was something that he was within his means, so he pursued that.
Is there an estimate of any historical record on how much were his earnings during the time, given the present day average earnings then?
No, it's very very difficult, there's messages of both him doing very successfully in terms of he writes that there's a great deal of demand for his rocket mails, and on one occasion where Smith went up to near the Himalayas because he was aware of this aircraft flight to the summit, and the very first planes to fly around the summit of Everest, he had some covers he gave to the pilots as souvenirs they would sell. He was charged 1 guinea, that's just over £1, for each cover, which is really, really quite expensive. But then he saw prices for purchases afterwards as collectors were willing to pay about £20 per cover. So there is some evidence that he's doing okay financially from these covers, but also in one of his letters he writes to Victor Pont, and he says one state that he's really stuck for money, and this is in the mid 1930s, so it's about the same time. So this mixed messages, there's a great deal of demand for his rocket covers, but also he's stuck for cash, and I'm suspecting that from about 1935 onwards he did not generate any income from his dentistry practice, which he had at home, but all of his income came from rocket covers and little income from the books that he published and was selling. So I think most of the time, as with most startups, he struggled, as mostly with startups today, he struggled financially, and in the end, particularly the Second World War and all the difficulties that surrounded him in Calcutta and his illness, he really didn't make a great deal of money, although today his covers still continue to be traded at very, very high values.
So where does the aerophilately and rocket mail community stands today? Is this as enthusiastic today? Because the technology is, of course, very mature. We have, many commercial services like FedEx carrying mail across the world today, and I don't know about the rocket mail community as well.
Well, there's this wonderful experiment in 1959 where the US Navy demonstrate what Smith had been doing for a long time with his rockets, but they used a cruise missile. So it launched from a submarine and landed on a runway, uncrewed and automated, of course, but they used a cruise missile to demonstrate the concept of, I suppose then it would be called missile mail. But yeah, you're right. The days of rocket mail, as such, have ended because aircraft can do this more regularly, more conveniently, more cheaply, because they can fly mail as well as people. But the astrophilately, as it stands, is really quite a growing field. Since the space age, in particular, space station has seen envelopes being stamped. Envelopes have been stamped in lunar orbit. The Apollo 11 astronauts stamped 2 envelopes on their way back from the moon. Neil and Buzz were supposed to do that on the surface of the moon, but they ran out of time. And David Scott in Apollo 15, he used a rubber stamp and stamped an envelope on the surface of the moon, and both the rubber stamp and the envelope are now in the National Air and Space Museum. Rakesh Sharma, when he was on board the Salyut 7 in 1984, he also stamped some envelopes, and when he returned to Earth, he sold them to generate some money for some local hospitals. So this area of astrophilately is still growing, and every time there's something new and unique to mark an event, philately still plays a part. And a recent experiment by Jeff Bezos collected envelopes from various school kids, and he put them on in a capsule suborbital flight, but he demonstrated that philately is live and kicking even today. Overall, the book on I think Stephen Smith for me was kind of inspiring to see a guy experiment in British India, having no backers, no money, no VC funding, no engineering backgrounds, and no support of many kind, and still going at it for more than a decade. And it's kind of inspiring to see that it kept him going for such a long time. And after which, in the 40s, he had to face the problems that came with World War II, and then the struggles of the Indian independence, and so many problems that I see that Stephen Smith had to undergo. But it looks like he also had to suffer, his activity had to suffer during the war and the pre-independence time in India, right? Yeah, and this is the thing that got to me. We all know people who struggle and make their way in life, but this was Stephen Smith. In the end, he perhaps didn't make a huge contribution to rocketry, but his effort, his persistence over so many years, and doing it alone and unsupported, and really being ignored by the authorities, that's the story of the book. It's just a personal story. It just happens to be about rockets, which got me in there. But that's really the story that I wanted to bring out of the shadows. I think he deserves some recognition, which he never got in his lifetime. I think in those days, the communication that he had was through the journals and letters, and because a lot of those, especially letters, weren't published, there's a lot of information in the archives. I'm sure it's still out there. When he died, a lot of his personal documents were made spread all over the place. Many were sold off to some collectors in India, but some of it I was surprised to read. This is another letter that I found in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Somebody was selling his material or his documents, his collection, a year after he died in San Francisco. So again, he had a much greater presence outside India than he did inside India.
So, Gurbir, my final question to you would be: we've all had to undergo a lot of struggles, which are very similar, but in the new space realm, where we're also trying to find, means to our technology and how to mature a lot of it, and trying to find backers, trying to find takers, so many of them, and we can get a lot of inspiration from somebody like a Stephen Smith, but there's also, you know, the lessons from the failures of Stephen Smith, and to just deal with ever not being able to have any success, for example, and still going at it, is also very inspiring. Your book, I think, has been very insightful in learning about a lot of these things. And so, was there anything that you would want to tell us about specific lessons that from Stephen Smith that we could take within the new space community here?
I was saying that the story of Stephen Smith in the book is pretty much a human story. And although it's a very different world of the 1930s in India, using powder rocket mails and very small rockets over short distances, and of course we're not talking about space in any way. Yes, there are many parallels that we can draw. And in fact, in many ways, I think listening to some of your episodes on NewSpace India podcast helped me join the dots between what Smith was experiencing then and what we're experiencing today. And some of your guests highlight the difficulties that startups have with the government inaction, or in some cases because of the actions that governments take. And I'm using this as an example of the NewSpace India in India and Indian government, but I think this is valid around the world. So, in India particularly, unless there's a law that allows it, it's illegal. And that's really not very helpful. And I remember listening to some of your contributors. I think it was Sushmita Mohanty, who engaged with Israel, but expressed the frustration, difficulties that she had in day-to-day activities. Mahesh Murthy, I think, very vocal guy, he expressed Israel's reluctance to support Indian satellite manufacturers. And it was only when he got support from SpaceX, then he went back to Israel, who offered him a launch on PSLV. He shouldn't have had to do that. Rajna Kaul talks eloquently about the absence of a space policy. The recent episode about the absence or the desire for a space regulatory authority of India. All of these issues make India, in the absence of a space bill, really, it's a tough time for new space actors in India to operate. And one of the saddest things, I remember one of your episodes was with Deepika Jakodi, who's a space lawyer practicing in Europe, and she was advised that she should not return to India. And I thought it was very sad, because people like her, especially once the space bill does exist, are going to be so important. And the recent announcement by the finance minister to support the private sector to create a level playing field, I found that fairly superficial. I would have liked the government to go further. So all these are the hurdles that we see in India today. And Smith had them in his time. I think if Smith had contact with people of similar interests and perhaps financial support from either benefactors or perhaps even the government or the military, which he tried unsuccessfully. Maybe there could have been an organization called the Indian Interplanetary Society to go alongside the one in America and the BIS in Britain in the early 30s. And the BIS was one of the founding organizations that was present at the first Paris meeting in 1950, where the IAF, the International Astronautical Federation, was founded. Friedrich Schmiedel, was present at that time. Perhaps if things had gone better, Smith could have been there representing India. As you're finding in NewSpace India, the absence of the government support is holding back progress now, sadly, as it did for Smith in his time. But who knows, maybe the future will be a bit more optimistic. We'll see.
Kirby, this has been yet another fascinating episode, and we've had a chat for almost 90 minutes on Stephen Smith. And thank you very much again for appearing on the show and discussing a lot of details on the book. And I definitely recommend the listeners to go check out the book, and I'll put a description and a link to the book itself for people to have a look. Thank you again for appearing on the show.
Thank you. The book is available in India. Unfortunately, because of the COVID-19, only ebooks available at the moment, but the paper and hardback versions will be available soon. Thank you very much for your time, Narayan.